happens when your child starts to fall between the cracks? A round peg in a square hole, the in-betweener. Raising a neurodivergent child is full of challenges and often with very little support. As parents, we have no training at all, and yet we are expected to navigate not only our children's needs, but also the complexities of the education system for SEN kids. Luckily for us, we have Lloyd, author of Raising the SEN-Betweeners, an honest guide to parenting the kids who fall between the gaps. She is also content creator and co-founder of Send Reform England, and lovingly known on Instagram as ASD with a G and T. Lisa uses humour and honesty to raise awareness of hidden disabilities. She is passionate about sharing the realities of parenting neurodivergent kids and offers support and community to those on a similar path. In the episode, we talk about busting stereotypes and the early signs and struggles around diagnosis, the challenge of masking and mainstream schooling, and the emotional toll of handling those breaking point moments. I really hope you enjoy this episode. Lisa, it's so great to have you here. My absolute dream with this podcast is to create a community. And I feel by us sitting here with a cuppa, having a natter, is a brilliant place to start, isn't it?
Oh, definitely. And this is just, heavenly for me. Away from the kids, having a cup of tea, not being interrupted. Oh, it's perfect.
Bliss. So maybe, Lisa, you can just start by telling the listeners a little bit about you and your family.
Yeah, so I am a mum of 2 autistic children. I've recently been diagnosed myself as well, very recently, at the age of 41. I've got a social media page, ASD with a G and T, which has sort of grown over the years. Really, I started out just doing silly dancing and things like that on there. And the more I started talking about autism and things like that, the more I realised there's a huge community out there that are actually feeling quite alone and quite lost. And it was amazing because, this community online has just sort of come together and grown from that and supporting each other. So then most recently I ended up writing a book, which has done really, really well. It's called Raising the SEN-Betweeners, because my children are sort of the ones who are sort of in the middle somewhere.
Fall in the cracks.
Yes. Yeah. Not, they can't cope with mainstream, but sort of not severe or complex needs enough for SEN school. So, yeah, I call them the SEN-Betweeners.
It's a great name. It's a perfect name. It explains it beautifully. Just going back to the beginning and when Finn was born. Finn's your eldest, isn't he?
Yes.
Do you think that you had an instinct quite early on?
Oh, 100%. Yeah, so early on. I mean, people wouldn't believe it, to be honest, when I say I knew something was going on from a baby, like literally weeks. But I really did, because he didn't behave how other babies behaved. One of the main things was that he didn't like being held. And so to comfort him, I would have to lay him down on the floor or somewhere, strip off all his clothes apart from his nappy, and that would calm him down rather than me actually holding him, which of course now we know is probably all sensory issues and things like that. But obviously at the time it's sort of quite shocking as a mum where you can't comfort your own child. And then as time went on, obviously when other children start interacting more, they smile back, clap, wave, point. He wasn't doing all of those sort of social things that he should have been doing. He was meeting all his milestones, so his speech was fine, walking, everything like that was fine, but it was all the social side not answering to his name and things like that. So the signs were definitely there from the start.
There's that question, isn't there, of what you imagine motherhood to be versus the reality. And we all have these expectations that we're going to go to baby groups. And actually, you talk about that in the book, in your very first chapter, which is Comparison is the Thief of Joy.
Yeah.
And I suppose that's the first moment, perhaps, where you force yourself into these situations because you think it's how it should be.
Yeah.
And it's miserable.
It was, honestly, that was one of the things that I wish I hadn't have done now, was try to force us to do all these things, because he absolutely hated it. And people would know that we were coming because they would hear him screaming. And we would spend the whole time with him crying. I would leave there crying. But I carried on doing it every week, and I have no idea why. Both of us hated it, but I think it's because you so desperately are sort of trying to fit into the norm somehow, and thinking, well, if I keep exposing him enough, surely it will be fine. Whereas obviously I know better now, and know that wasn't the environment for him. It was probably too noisy, chaotic, with all other babies and toddlers and things there. But it's one of those things where you desperately sort of want to find people, but when you're around them, you feel completely isolated anyway, because you can't talk, because you're comforting your child all the time. And you're looking around at all these happy babies, loving it all, and you're sort of looking at your own, and you shouldn't do, but you do naturally. And you're thinking, what have I done wrong? And that's the thing, you start blaming yourself and thinking that you've done something.
And also, for you, Finn was your first, so you had nothing to kind of compare him to.
No.
What was going on, what was the noise around you at the time with your family and friends? How were they, as Finn became a toddler, what was the kind of narrative that you were hearing?
I just kept hearing that he's always very serious. I heard that a lot. Very serious baby. Just they're always fine here. It's all boys. Boys always do that. Or, when I started looking into it and started thinking it was autism, be like, no, he doesn't look autistic, and all of that.
I loved that bit in your book where you quote Rain Man.
Yes. Yeah.
Because it is just that stereotype of what people perceive autism to be, which is, what we're trying to break down those stereotypes.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, in all honesty, that's all I knew as well. As far as I was concerned at the time, I'd never met an autistic person in my life. Now I know I am, and most of my family are. But, at the time, it was like, it was Rain Man. It was non-verbal. It was high care needs. And that was what you were looking at. And I think, when people say they don't look autistic and things, I think that's probably what they're meaning. But it was so frustrating, because even with my husband, he thought it was my depression and things like that, because he wasn't coming to all the baby groups. He wasn't seeing how all the other children were behaving, and thought I was overreacting, until he saw it for himself and saw how extreme the meltdowns were and things like that, and agreed we needed to go and get seen.
What was the pivotal point?
It was when we went to a friend's house, and I knew before going in there it was going to be awful, because I'd gone to other friends' houses, people had come to ours, and it was horrific. So Finn had a very, very sort of extreme anxiety of people, just any people in general. And so we went to a friend's house, and Terry was with me for the first time, and he had the most horrific meltdown. There was no calming him down at all. And it got to, I think we'd probably lasted about an hour. We'd taken him into the garden. We tried to take him away. There was no calming him. And that is when we left, and my husband said to me, yeah, we need to go to a doctor or something because this is not right. And finally, I was like so relieved that somebody was agreeing with me. And that is when we obviously got him referred.
It took a very long time to get Finn diagnosed, didn't it?
Yeah. So he was referred at the age of 2 and he wasn't diagnosed until the age of 6. And that, again, is because he's not your stereotypical autistic child. Academically, he was fine. He could read and write, and he was verbal, and he was masking throughout school. He was masking a hell of a lot. So, it took that time for the paediatricians to sort of see really what was going on, and unfortunately took for him to start failing and start getting behind and things because he couldn't cope anymore.
Yeah. So then Poppy came along.
Yes.
And it was a very different story with Poppy. Can you tell us a little bit?
So basically I've got the opposites. So Finn is, I say that he's the fun police because he's very strict on the rules, very black and white. And Poppy is complete opposite, where the rules are supposed to be broken. She is chaos. And the beginning journey, to be honest, in the very beginning, we didn't think it was autism because she was very different to Finn, very social, very happy after she got over her feeding problems. But then she was speech delayed. She started flapping, tiptoe walking, and we thought, something might be going on here as well. But when people say you've met one autistic person, you really have, because, even with my children that have been essentially brought up the same, complete opposites of each other.
You spoke about something, well, I found it very moving when you took Poppy to A&E. You reached an absolute crisis point.
Yes.
What happened?
It was, so in the very early stages with Poppy, she was not feeding. We tried everything that the doctors said about. She was dropping weight. She was screaming all the time. You know the newborn cry of when they're hungry?
Yeah. It
was that all the time. And so we'd try and feed her, and then she would feed for a little bit, stop, and then scream. And it was like she was in pain all the time. And obviously all of this crying and everything was setting off Finn with his meltdowns. We were still in the process of getting him diagnosed at the time. And in all honesty, we thought we'd made the biggest mistake ever having her. And it's awful to say that now because she's absolutely incredible and I love her more than anything. But at that time, I thought, why have we done this to ourselves? And, we got to the stage where I said to Terry, I've got to take her to A&E because I cannot cope. I cannot cope anymore. I was in a pit of depression. Even Terry was at that stage. And I think that gets overlooked a lot of times with the men and how it affects them as well. So I took her to A&E and I walked in and I literally handed her over to the receptionist, complete stranger, and I said, you need to take my baby. I cannot do this anymore. And I get quite emotional talking about it.
I'm sure.
And it was probably like the darkest point for me because the one thing that you want to be able to do is feed your child and make them happy. And I just felt desperate at that point. I didn't know what to do. Thankfully, they were amazing there. And they let me sit outside for a bit, calm down. They looked after her for a bit. And then I got seen by a doctor. And he suggested weaning early. Which actually changed everything for us. And I still don't know to this day what it was. I believe it was probably sensory issues with the food, because she's always struggled with feeding, like she still does now. So I think that's probably what it came down to. But, you know, it was a real sort of breaking point then.
Thank you for sharing that, because I think in reality, we've all reached those breaking point moments where we have felt just anybody take them.
Yeah.
You reach that bottom of the pit and you just don't know how to get up. So, you know, I think it's really brave of you for talking about that and sharing the reality of it.
That's the thing. I don't want anybody else to feel alone with that. You know, I think especially us women, we go through so much with the hormone changes, postnatal depression, all things like that. And then when you've got a child with additional needs on top of that, you know, there's no rule book, there's no guide, we don't know what we're doing. And it's terrifying. It's absolutely terrifying.
I think that's the thing as well, isn't it, with raising neurodiverse kids, that you have the layer of motherhood anyway, and then you have this additional layer, and nobody tells you have no qualifications in what you're doing. And even when you get the diagnosis, often you're left. And then what? Where's my community? Where's my support? How do I manage this? How am I supposed to be this temple of Zen when I'm being completely challenged? And, you know, I think what you talk about so eloquently and with humour and such warmth in the book is the reality of raising these SEN-betweeners. Now, Poppy was diagnosed much quicker.
Yes.
And Finn then starts school and the mask goes on. You obviously know that mask is on. How did you manage that with the school? If they're saying to you, he's coping fine at school, and you know full well as a parent that actually he's masking.
Yeah, and which is a huge problem. You know, like I said, my children are opposite. So with Poppy, she would be having meltdowns and trashing the place and things like that at school. And in some ways, as weird as it sounds, I was relieved because I was like, she's letting it out. Yeah. She's comfortable enough to let it out. Whereas Finn had all this anxiety, all of this pent up emotions that he needed to get out, but he couldn't release it there. And it was heartbreaking to watch because bit by bit, I watched my child become a shadow of himself. He lost his personality. I could get upset talking about it again.
Of course.
He lost all his personality, and he would come home and there would be meltdowns constantly, meltdowns trying to get him into school. I would come away from it feeling like the worst mum in the world and so guilty because I would leave him there knowing he's going to suffer all day and suffer in silence as well, which is the worst thing. And, you know, it was just so frustrating because you'd have meetings with the teachers and things and they'd say, it's absolutely fine, very quiet, very well behaved. And I just knew that wasn't him. And, you know, it's sort of been proven now that he's at the right setting now, that he can be himself and he's finally coming back to life again. And, you know, I knew it was affecting him, but not even to this extent now that I've seen him in the setting that he should be in.
You talk about the corridor children at mainstream schools who are in a class of 30 to 34 children and can't cope with the sensory overload and are in the corridor.
Yeah.
It is a huge issue. You, along with other people, started SEND Reform to try and raise some awareness.
Yes. Yeah. Unfortunately, there's a lot that's wrong with the education system and the funding for our children. There's thousands of children that are without a school place. There's thousands that are forced into mainstream when they should be in a SEN setting. Thousands without an EHCP. that they desperately need. And, you know, like you said, there's the corridor children, the ones that they're being forced into mainstream, saying, you know, we need to make it all inclusive and everything like that. But actually, they're spending their days being excluded. They're being on the outside because they can't cope with the mainstream environment and the busy classrooms and things. They need extra attention. They need movement breaks. They need sensory toys. And the mainstreams can't provide it. And, you know, this isn't the fault with the teachers. You know, I think on the whole, the teachers are fantastic and they are as frustrated as the parents are a lot of the time. It is unfortunately coming down from the government with the funding and it being spent in the wrong places. And, you know, thousands of parents are having to go to tribunal and things like that to try and get their child the education that they need. And, you know, we live in the UK. Like, you don't expect when you're pregnant or, you know, early years of having a baby that you're going to have to fight for an education for your child. It's crazy.
Well, again, it goes back to that, you know, you're constantly advocating and constantly fighting for your child. Just going back to the EHCP, which is the Educational Healthcare Plan, what was that process like for you with Finn?
So again, it was hard work and a fight again. And, you know, we got it, they refused to even assess in the beginning because he was academically what they classed as okay. He went to school and he was about a year to 2 years ahead academically.
Yeah, he knew his alphabet at the age of 1.
Yes, he was incredible. He was obsessed. I mean, now we know it was probably a special interest.
Yes, do you think?
Yeah, we were like, oh, we've got a genius child. But no, it was just a special interest. But it was, yeah, he knew all of it. He could read, write beautifully. And obviously that started to deteriorate. And so the teachers knew we needed an EHCP for him once the mask started to drop and everything.
And you said about the mask, about how, you know, really what that mask is, masking a child that's really struggling.
Yeah.
And that really got me.
It is.
You know.
It is. It's, you know, it breaks my heart to think of how many are out there that are struggling inside and nobody knows. And, you know, that leads on to mental health problems as they get older, you know, especially the teen years and things.
Self-esteem,
confidence. All of it, confidence, everything. And, you know, it is absolutely no good for them. And it's draining. I mean, you imagine spending all day pretending to be somebody that you're not and having to play this part, and it's heartbreaking. And, you know, that is where it causes the issues because they can't get the support and they can't get the EHCPs. And that's why it was such a fight for us, because of that mask. And it was only when he was completely failing that they would then come and assess. And, you know, why are we waiting until they fail? Why are we not catching them before they fall?
Yeah. And listening to the parents.
Yeah, and the teachers as well. You know, it's ludicrous to me because it's so much harder to then pick up the broken pieces, put them back together.
Because damage has been done.
Yeah.
And trauma.
Yeah.
You know, school trauma. And then you get the school refusing.
Exactly.
And you were talking about simple adaptations for schools, you know, even being a bit more flexible on school uniform, turning up to school a little bit later when it's not such a mad rush. Maybe there's a point of contact when you arrive at school.
Yeah.
You know, the sensory toys can, to an outsider, be seen as distraction, but actually it really helps them to focus.
Exactly. And this is where we need to start looking at being more neurodivergent friendly in the schools, because if you're more neurodivergent friendly, all of the children will benefit. But if you're only looking after the neurotypicals, then, you know, all of those SEN children are going to miss out. And, you know, we need to get away from looking at these as like fidget toys and things like that, looking at them as toys. They're actually learning aids. And
which is a much better use of language to say that. I find when having these conversations about neurodiversity, so much is the language.
Yeah.
And also going back to being understanding, you know, why are our neurodivergent children having to adapt into a neurotypical world? Why aren't the neurotypical world making more adaptations for the neurodiverse world? Surely it's going to only enrich everybody.
Exactly. I mean, you look at it, for instance, movement breaks. I mean, every child, whether they're neurotypical or neurodivergent, will benefit from that. Of course they will. And, you know, we've seen they do this in other countries and it works fantastically. You know, people are not designed to sit at a desk all day, you know, and it's going to end up making them learn better. And, you know, it's so needed. And just health-wise, it's so needed. And, you know, I think this is where the schools are very outdated still. Yeah. And it's really never changed over the years very much from how it used to be. And it needs to be, the whole system needs an overhaul, to be honest.
Lisa, let's talk about special interests. There was a bit in your book where you were like, my child has talked at me.
Oh dear, for a long, long time.
And you become quite expert in these special interests. And just when you think you've nailed it and, you know, you've themed their birthday presents around it or Christmas, they've moved on to another interest.
Every time. And again, this is another thing that I didn't realise could happen. So when I knew about autism and things like that, I thought the special interest just stayed with them. You know, you think about people who love trains or something like that, stays with them throughout life. And of course it does with some autistic people. But for some like mine, their special interests last maybe a month sometimes, and then they're on to the next. And the original special interest is dead to them. That is gone and done. And, you know, we have stocked up on so many different things over the years. I mean, Poppy's now had a special interest of SpongeBob for a very, very long time now.
Right.
So this is one that I'm not sure whether
it's going to go.
It's going to go, to be honest. But of course, what comes with that, you've only got so many episodes you can watch on repeat.
But what is quite useful about the special interests is using them with their learning.
Yes.
You know, so if schools tapped into what their special interests were, like I always think these books, which are like, you know, whatever they are, I can't even remember the names of the characters in those books. I can't believe I can't remember the names because I'm hearing them all the time. But if, you know, you gave them a book which was about their special interest, they'd be more likely to want to go and learn and pick it up and read about it and then write about it.
Exactly that. And that's what they do at Poppy's school. So they will print out different worksheets. So how many Patricks are there and things like that. So that will engage her then. And she will be doing maths without realising she's doing maths, which is perfect for PDA. There's a lot of sort of tricking her into things.
And actually, so PDA is pathological demand avoidance, but you renamed it with Poppy as, what was it?
Poppy doesn't agree.
Poppy doesn't agree. Brilliant. Christmas is a really tricky time for neurodivergent families, and it really flips, again, tradition on its head. And you really have to kind of dig deep into realising that the way that you perhaps envisaged it would be is not actually the reality of it. And one of those is even the simplicity of wrapping a present, because they've got to unwrap it, then they've got to say thank you to the person that's given it, and they've got to like it, but they are so literal that you don't know what they're going to say and you probably want the ground to swallow you up. But there was something you wrote about your mum. She now gives Poppy a box and the gifts aren't wrapped. I just thought that was just so lovely of your mum and just such a brilliant idea.
Yeah, it's amazing, because I think some of them, it's the fear of what is under the wrapping and everything like that, and they don't actually enjoy that experience. So, and Poppy would get very overwhelmed with it all. So the best thing that my mum did was we would go to hers on Christmas Day. She would have a box full of new toys in there. Poppy would just open the box and just look through it all. And it's a very gentle process then. There's no expectations. It's literally just like she's found a toy box. What's in here? And, it's up to her whether she looks in it, whether she takes some things out or not. But it did take us a while to get there. And, leading up to that, I would be terrified with people bringing presents around and things like that, because I know that if we have already got that toy or they don't like it, they are going to tell that person. And that person's therefore going to be heartbroken and they're going to come across as rude. And you do want the ground to swallow you up sometimes, but they're just very blunt and say it as they see it.
You've given some brilliant literal thinking examples in your book. One, when you were on the loo and the postman was at the door.
Don't. Honestly.
Who answered the door? Who was it?
So it was Poppy, I believe. And yeah, it was horrifying. And it's Mummy's having a poo upstairs and I could just hear it. And I was like, no.
But by writing that in your book, we've all had those moments where they just say it how it is, and actually, you can't help but kind of, you have to smile.
Yeah,
you have to find the humour, which I think you do so brilliantly in the way that you write. There's such a brilliant mixture of that just heartbreaking stuff that goes on, finding the humour, and every chapter in your book relates to something, whether it's not exactly the same, we can all relate, like the bag that you take out with you that's just full of all the sensory toys, the wipes,
my granny trolley,
the change of clothes, and also just how it's almost like the toddler years don't end.
Yes.
The toddler, and actually you start to realise that the gap with the peers is widening, whereas when they're toddlers, they can kind of blend in a bit more. But as they get older, that's when you see the gap widening.
It is. And I think the problem is, especially with the public as well, when they see a toddler stimming, running in circles, doing what they would class as odd behaviour, it's sweet, it's funny, it's cute. When they see a teenager doing those things, it's not so cute anymore and it's classed as bad behaviour. And that's when you see more and more judgments and things like that as they get older. They don't expect to see a teenager having a meltdown and screaming in public. And it's like,
it's the hidden disability that we need to raise awareness of. The chapter in your book which grabbed my heart was Peace Begins Where Expectations End. And it's kind of the grief, dealing with the grief from the moment of diagnosis and then all the milestones and landmarks within their kind of years growing up.
Yeah, it's really tough. And I think those moments of grief, they carry on but at different stages. And I think people think it's just at the beginning when they get diagnosed and it's, you're sort of, it's not that you would want to change your child or anything, but obviously you don't want your child to struggle throughout life. Nobody would. And so you have that sort of, that heartbreak there, that life is always going to be that much tougher for them. And, then I found these moments sort of hit me out of the blue. We had it on Finn's last year of primary school, and there was a residential trip that they all go on. They stay away camping and stuff like that. He couldn't do any of that and he couldn't cope with it. And I was in the WhatsApp group with all the mums of the neurotypical children, and they're all sharing photos of it and, all their children building those bonds more and more. And you're just out on the edge of all of that. And, you know, it's really difficult, but you sort of have to look at it like, you know, my husband made a very good point to me where he was like, Finn doesn't want to do that. It's you that wants him to do that. He's not missing out, but it's you feeling that he's missing out. And that is the problem there. And it's so true, because he'd be miserable going. He didn't want to do it. He's not upset that he hasn't bonded with them, you know, camping and things like that. But it's my expectations. It's my expectations of what life was going to be like with having children. We was going to go to dance classes and
happy days out.
Yes,
we just get in the car and all would be well.
Yeah,
and they'd love it.
Yeah, all those things. And it's like, and it's not that way. And it's adjusting to that, which is really, really difficult.
And you talking about being on the edge, it's like being at the school gates, feeling on the edge, you know, feeling on the edge was it within those WhatsApp groups where your reality is just that you are grateful they've got into school that day.
Yes.
Not, you know, whether they've forgotten their coat.
Yeah.
Which probably won't wear anyway.
Yeah.
But, you know, your whole perspective shifts, and it's trying to find your community within that. I just want to read, there's a quote. When Finn got his diagnosis, you write that the paediatrician said how sorry he was and he can still live a good life with support. And you replied saying these were tears of relief, not sadness.
Yeah.
And it's hard not to, when you think of something like that, that somebody would see it as a negative. Because I see these neurodiverse kids as a huge positive. I mean, what they teach us, what they give us, you cheer that child on more than you thought you would ever cheer a child
100%.
on. They do the simplest thing and you're moved to tears because the pride, you know, knowing what they are going through every single day.
Yeah.
And you are their safe place and you know them and they know that you've got them.
Yeah.
And that continuous kind of fight and advocacy and desire for them to reach their full potential. I just thought how sad it was that was said to you.
Yes, I mean,
do you feel the same, or do you?
Yeah, I still get that now. I actually had a taxi driver, and we were talking, and I said I've got 2 autistic children, and he went, "I'm so sorry," to me the other day, and I'm like, "You don't need to be sorry. You don't need to be sorry at all. These children are incredible," and you know, I quite often say I actually wouldn't change their autism. I wouldn't take it away if I had the choice. Now, I realise that some people would. And I do understand that as well, because obviously it is a spectrum and there are some that will suffer with autism more than others, if you see what I mean. And it will affect their life a lot more than it possibly will with my children. So I think it's, you know, everybody is entitled to feel how they feel about it. But it is sad that people still think of it as such a negative. And I think it's so important that we do look at the positives of it as well, because there are so many positives. And, you know, that there's hundreds of things that I could say, that the way that their mind works, their honesty, you know, it's incredible. And, you know, they could make fantastic employees and things like that in the future. But it's trying to get people to understand that, yes, it's a disability and it does hinder them in some ways, but it also, they gain a lot from it as well. And this is what I've tried to teach my own children. You know, when we talk about autism to them and everything, is, you know, you will be affected in some ways, where I try and put a spin on it. So, you know, like with the hearing and things, I'm like, you've got much better hearing than neurotypical people, but that does mean you might struggle in noisy places more. So it's trying to sort of them to see the positives, but how it can make them struggle as well.
Just before we finish, Lisa, I'd just love to ask you, I think all of us, when you have a child that's diagnosed with a neurodiversity, you do start to question your own brain and the brains of those around you. And obviously you've recently been diagnosed with autism. How are you feeling? Do you feel that it's helping you understand better, not only about yourself, but also for your children?
Yeah, I definitely do. I was in two minds whether to even get assessed, to be honest. At my age, I thought I've come this far. But it was like therapy, because it made me realise how much I've masked throughout my life and done things that I didn't want to do. And and it really made me look at myself more as well, because I've always struggled with jobs and things like that and gone from one to the next. And the assessor made a really good point, because I said to her, people may think that I'm really confident and things because of what I do on social media. And she's like, no, quite far from it. She said, if you look, she said, you've chosen a job now that you don't have to work with anybody. So you've got no colleagues. You're at home in your safe place and you can switch off whenever you want. And I was like, oh my God, that's so true.
And you've got humour, haven't you?
Yeah.
You're bringing humour to your life and to all our lives as well. Thank you, Lisa.
I'm so glad.
Just for anybody who is touched by the subjects we're talking about, Raising the SEN Between Us is... Honestly, I laughed, I cried. It was a real companion, and I'm so thankful to you for writing it. At the end of each chapter, there are top tips, which I really found very helpful. And I just want to finish with a quote from your book, which is, "We are simply ordinary people looking after extraordinary little people. And what a gift this is to do so."
Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. That's it for this episode of Let's Talk Neurodivergent Kids. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please do subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with anyone who might find it helpful. Your support really means so much and helps us to reach more families navigating the world with their neurodivergent children. I'd also really love to hear from you, so you can get in touch via email, that's hello@letstalkndkids.com, or message me on @letstalkndkids on Instagram. Thanks for listening, and join me next time on Let's Talk Neurodivergent Kids.